Everybody, please remember to like, subscribe, and share. Good evening, everybody, and welcome back to the show. Got your boy Chris here and the great historian Lucas Wilder with me, and he is going to talk about one of my favorite battles, the Battle of the Wilderness. Lucas, how are you, man?
I'm doing just fine and dandy. How are you?
I'm well. Great to have you back on. Okay, so let's go back to May of 1863, and Lee is sitting there, and he's not sure what Grant's doing. First question I got for you: why doesn't he react first? Is that's just his style as a chess player? Let them make the first move.
Well, I'll correct you before everybody on YouTube corrects you. 1864 is when we're talking
I'm
about.
sorry. I just woke up, and my bad. Thank you though.
No problem. I just know that there's a lot of people out there that'll be putting in the comment section, you got that wrong.
Yeah.
But why is Lee waiting? He's a very tactful person. He's measuring out his moves, and he's got a new commander in front of him. Grant has been out west this entire time, and he's finally moved east. He's taken in control of the Army of the Potomac. Although technically Meade still has command, he's watching over him with the peering over his shoulder and even offering commands, which actually makes the battle a little bit more complicated than it probably would have been, especially for the Union in that case. But Lee is kind of feeling out Grant at the moment, and he's just waiting to move. He knows he's at a disadvantage at this point. He's outnumbered, which has always been the case. But if you watch Lee's movements and you watch Lee's tactful ideas and his strategy throughout the war, he waits for the right moment. He sees where the enemy moves, and then he reacts many times. That's not every time, but especially with a new commander, he's going to let them try to make the first move. He does that at Fredericksburg. Burnside moves towards him. He moves, and then subsequently he moves.
So where is Grant headed? Is he trying to get through the orange and plank roads quickly and get through the wilderness? Is he moving down towards Spotsylvania when Lee gets him? Where's Grant moving first?
Let's actually take a bigger picture of the situation, because Grant's movements are not just in a vacuum, not just related to what he's doing with Robert E. Lee. Grant and Lincoln together have made this huge plan. Lincoln described it as skinning an animal. He said, those not skinning can hold a leg. It's a war of a strategy, or a war of constant pressure. And so not only is Grant with Meade and the Army of the Potomac heading south against Lee, but he's also got the 9th Army Corps under Burnside is coming with him. That's actually another topic of discussion, that Burnside actually outranks Meade at this point. So Meade cannot give Burnside direct orders. So that's why Grant is kind of in there as a mediary, so he can move the 9th Corps when Meade can't. But nonetheless, he's got the 9th Corps with him, and Benjamin Butler with the Army of the James is moving towards Richmond. Franz Sigel is coming down the valley, the Shenandoah Valley, that is, or I guess up the valley. If you're from Virginia, it's considered going up the valley if you're heading south. Sherman's moving towards central Georgia, and Nathaniel Banks is going towards Mobile and eventually hoping to go towards Montgomery. So this is a war of constant pressure against the Confederacy. So we can't look at the Battle of the Wilderness as this one section. This is a huge event in the war. It's a war of constant pressure. This is a huge strategy that only the Wilderness is a small part of. But back to your question, Grant is attempting to move somewhere out of the Wilderness. His intention is not to fight in the Wilderness. He's wanting to move a little bit further, he knows he can't get in between Lee, or at least he doesn't think he can, because Lee can maneuver his troops fairly fast. But what he's trying to do is bring Lee to battle somewhere in the open terrain outside of the Wilderness. And as we find out, that does not happen.
Was he trying to get? Because I've heard people tell me two things. Was he trying to go down the orange and plank roads, turnpike, and Lee just jumped on him before he could get out?
Yeah, Lee is doing a reaction, and so when Grant is moving his troops forward, moving his troops towards the south, and then eventually moving them slightly to the west, when Lee makes contact with him on the Orange Turnpike, that sets in a full range of motions that Grant starts throwing troops in. His orders to all of his corps commanders is, attack what's in front of you, because we've brought on a general engagement. And that's one of the beautiful things about Grant, is that even though his plans do not go the way he wants them, he's able to change. Lee got wind of Grant's plans, thanks in part to Jeb Stuart and his cavalry. The Confederate general was able to throw multiple divisions against the approaching Union forces, and Grant abandoned his plan quickly. Instead of attempting to salvage the old plan, which was, again, to bring Lee into the open, he simply goes with what's in front of him. Now, one thing I'd like listeners to understand is, what is the wilderness? We don't rightly understand. A lot of people talk about the wilderness without actually identifying what the wilderness is. The wilderness is a second growth forest. A local furnace called the Catherine Furnace had been used for had been used up, deforested to smelt iron. This clear cut the entire region. It's about a 70-mile region. Without an overarching canopy to prevent the underbrush from growing up on the forest floor, the entire region became an entangled mess of trees and brush. And so it's very difficult to move through. And so that's what the wilderness actually is. It's a second growth forest with tons of underbrush, because there was no overarching canopy that's going to keep any of that dense brush underneath from growing up.
Wow. Okay. So what happens first?
Well, the first of what's happening is actually a combination of infantry and cavalry are become engaged. Jeb Stuart is actually trying to kind of run interference, if you want to call it that, with trying to stall any Union forces that are coming down the Orange Turnpike, the Orange Plank Road, until Confederate infantry can move up. First is General Ewell's corps. General Ewell is moving across the Orange Turnpike, and then as he encounters Union forces there on the Orange Turnpike, General Hancock is moving towards the Orange Plank Road. A.P. Hill is then able to move his entire corps towards General Hancock's, and so this is what it boils down to, is just a slugfest between the two sides. The Union cavalry had performed fairly poorly during the preparation for the first day of fighting, but it was not entirely their fault. Meade had assigned 2 of the 3 divisions of cavalry of the Cavalry Corps to guard the supply wagons. This made Sherman very furious, because he's taken over 2/3 of the Cavalry Corps just to guard the supply wagons. And the reason he's trying to guard the supply wagons is because Jeb Stuart is out there, and he knows Jeb Stuart is attracted to wagons, and he goes after them. And so one cavalry division was used to screen the movements of the infantry, but the screening movement had not been successful, and the Confederate pickets, along with the cavalry, were able to discover the movements early, and that's why you have Lee able to react quickly, because he's getting the word of the Union infantry movements very quickly, and so he's able to maneuver very quickly. And so General Hancock opens up the sector on the Orange Plank Road, hoping to strike Lee before reinforcements could arrive, because General Ewell's on the Orange Turnpike and Union infantry's already engaged him. Hancock's moving a little bit further south and hoping to flank Ewell's corps, but that's when A.P. Hill's men start to attack General Hancock. The next morning, we see General Hancock's men attack, and once he had this is on May 6th, General Hancock attacks and just basically scatters General A.P. Hill's men. They are running for the hills at that point. And it's this, we talked about this on the last show, when General Longstreet's able to rush in at the last second. He's actually came from East Tennessee that spring, and he's arriving onto the battlefield just in time to save Lee. He literally, all Lee has to guard that flank, guard Ewell's right flank, is artillery, and that's quickly going to be overrun if something's not done about it. One thing that's saving Lee at that moment is that the entangled mess that we talked about, the wilderness, had broken up a bunch of Hancock's regiments and brigades. Just simply moving through those areas was difficult enough. And so when your lines are not dressed, as they would say, this forces a lot of regiments and companies to halt, reform the line, and then move. And so that little bit of time that the Wilderness buys for Lee is precious. And once Longstreet enters the battle, then it becomes another slugfest between him and Hancock.
We're talking about just minutes here.
Say it again.
Just minutes, and Lee was overrun.
Yes, absolutely. Within minutes, he would have been overrun.
Yeah, just everybody knows. This is the moment when the Texans arrive, and Lee actually starts leading them into the battle, right?
Yeah, he wants to. He's at the forefront of the battle at this point. He does that occasionally. He actually, and at Second Manassas, he goes ahead to look for himself at the situation that the Confederates are in, and he gets shot at by a sniper that he allegedly grazes his cheek. And so he's not unfamiliar with being at the front of the battle lines. And right here is a good example that he's right in front, but the Texans repeatedly tell him, no, we're not going until you get to the rear, because we don't want you getting killed. And that's an important moment. People have to understand what battle is like. You got to understand that when your leader goes down, the entire battle line, the entire struggle can be over with if your leader goes down, because not only does it demoralize your troops, but your commander is the one most intimately knowledgeable of how these regiments are aligned, how brigades are put into place, and if they go down, then you've got to replace that person with the next person in charge, who then has to know where all these battle lines are, and then their position has to be replaced by someone else. And so you've got this succession of officers having to replace one another, and it becomes a very chaotic situation. And we see that because you know who goes down during this attack? That's Longstreet. He gets shot in the shoulder, and it kind of gashes his neck. It seems almost like a mortal wound, and that's a scary situation. And that's one reason that when the fighting on the Orange Plank Road kind of stalls out, and Hancock's men are able to pull back all the way to some breastworks that they kind of threw up ad hoc. Longstreet's men kind of stall out and allow that to happen because he goes down. Chaos reigns on the battlefield, and that buys the Union a little bit more time.
So didn't A.P. Hill go down? Because I thought I remember reading somewhere that one time Lee was actually commanding both the corps.
A.P. Hill was ill, but he was still giving orders to my knowledge. Now, I'm not an expert on the Wilderness, but he is ill at the moment. He has long-standing problems, long-standing illnesses.
Right. Okay. So I think that somewhere I remember reading this somewhere that at one point Lee was actually had to command both the corps. But okay, sorry to interrupt you. General Ewell, though, he's doing good, right? I mean,
he's cautious, but his men are doing good. His men are actually in a very entangled mess. The battle lines are overlapped. The Wilderness is a thick undergrowth, and so when you have the Union soldiers, their battle lines are getting broken up, but the Confederate lines are getting broken up. And
individual fights, right?
Repeat that.
These are kind of like individual fights.
In a lot of ways, it is a lot of individual fights. You have A.P. Ewell's Corps, which their battle lines are overlapping. At one point, his line is almost at a weird angle. It's not a great situation, but he's holding his own, which people give Ewell a lot of grief because of one single event, and that's Gettysburg. Whether he could have done anything or not is besides the point. But Ewell is actually doing fairly well at this point, and the Confederates always did decent when they were defending. But that kind of goes for any Civil War army. If you're defending, you've got a huge advantage against an approaching foe.
So this battle, the slugfest, is raging. Now, I've often heard the flank attacks. What is Gordon's? Which one was? I know Gordon wasn't as big, but did Gordon not inflict as much damage almost?
Yeah, Gordon is launching an attack late on May 6th, and so he's trying to get around the Union right flank. Uh, he spots that the position is open, but there's a lot of miscommunication that happens, and so General Ewell is not sending his troops forward, and it ends up being just Gordon's men who do most of the attacking, and most of the outcome is from his lone units that are going into battle. But nearly it catches the Union completely off guard. Um, when Gordon starts flanking, he actually does push in the flank quite a bit. But because it's taken so long for him to move up through the wilderness, and there's no pressure to the front of the Union line, that means that the Union are able to send regiment after regiment to block Gordon's advance, and that stalls out. Um, People always ask the what if Gordon had been able to do it. His units were already tired. They're not going to be going too far. The only scenario where Gordon actually inflicts a ton of damage and actually is able to turn the flank is if Ewell moves and the rest of the army moves. But because of a lot of miscommunication, that doesn't happen. And that's what happens in a lot of Civil War battles. If you're asking the what if, it's usually because there's been a miscommunication somewhere in the battlefield, on the battlefield, and people aren't getting the messages they need to get. What a lot of people don't realize is when General Hancock's corps gets pushed back by Longstreet and they go back to those breastworks, word gets to the Union headquarters that Hancock's corps had been destroyed. But that wasn't the case. They had been beaten back, but that they had simply fallen back to the Brock Road. The erroneous report led Meade to withdraw the Union cavalry, which had been engaged with Jeb Stuart's cavalry. The two sides of cavalry were going at one another, and Meade orders the withdrawal, thinking that the whole Union line could be overtaken.
Didn't Hancock's or that attack get launched late too, and Hancock make the statement if it would have been carried out on time, they'd have rolled us up like a wet blanket?
Yeah, I think that was his quote. Yeah, Hancock was. Hancock is one of the least talked. Well, I won't say he's the least talked about. I don't think he gets the credit he deserves, because Hancock was a more than capable Army commander, and why he was never put in command of the entire Union Army, I'm not too sure about. But he's not. He goes for political office later, but he's not a politician, and he's not trying to do this for political gain. But Hancock is an extremely capable commander, and his men do get pushed back. And if a good attack could have been launched by the Confederates, again, they were kind of thrown into chaos when Longstreet gets hit. Hancock's men may not have been able to have held them off for another massive assault, especially once they've been beaten back and demoralized after they've already made such good progress earlier in the day.
I know the attacks didn't get carried out. What time did they? How long did it take them to they attack instead of when they planned on it?
When the Union were
I know Longstreet and Gordon's attack didn't go off on time. Do you know how many hours it took? They were delayed before they actually got to launch the attack.
I don't know the number of hours that they were actually delayed doing that.
Yeah. So this right here. Both these are at the end of the day, right?
Say that again.
Both these are closing up the end of the day's action, right?
Yes.
So, we're going to May 7th.
May 7th. It's an important day. The Confederates have a lot of problems. Longstreet had pushed back Hancock's corps, but he had become seriously wounded in the action. He had been shot less than 4 miles from where Stonewall Jackson, Lee's corps commander, had been wounded nearly exactly 1 year earlier. Wow. The wound had went into his shoulder again, severing some nerves and gashing his throat. And he was shot by his own men, just like Jackson had been. That's the chaos of the Wilderness campaign, the Wilderness battle. This led to the stalling of attacks. There's no central figure to move the divisions and the brigades forward. Lee held back the units to realign them. Again, the Wilderness is just ripping apart regiments and brigades. Lee holds them back to realign them to be able to push again, but this allows the Union to coordinate and reform. This clearly illustrates the chaos of battle and the chaos that the wilderness brought to Civil War commanders. By the close of May 6th, Lee's army had held off Grant, but at serious cost. Over 10,000 Southern casualties. Longstreet was out of action for the foreseeable future. A.P. Hill was seriously ill, and Ewell was still requiring supervision. Lee wasn't completely sold on him as being a great Corps commander, but he's capable, but Lee still had to supervise him in a lot of ways. Around 17,000 Union casualties by the end of that day. Lee was familiar with former Union commanders who would have, after such a brutal fight, they would have moved back to cross the river, resupply, and probably change commanders. That's usually how the order went, and then make another attempt a few months later. Instead, Grant began to move his army further south the very next day. This stunned Lee. Lee had been bloodied, so he's waiting. He has dealt with other commanders. Now he's having to decide what's going to happen now. He's going to move when Grant moves. Grant reportedly remarked to Meade that Joseph E. Johnston would have retreated after 2 days of such punishment. He also telegraphed Henry Halleck that, and this is his exact words, "At present, we can claim no victory over the enemy. Neither have they gained a single advantage," which is actually hopeful. When the Union commanders of the Army of the Potomac engage with Robert E. Lee, many times it's a victory or Lee has gained some kind of advantage, except if you want to count Antietam. And so when Grant is able to wire that to the War Department, this is a big morale boost. Even to Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln is sold on Grant. He has become, after the capture of Vicksburg, Lincoln says, "Grant is my man and I am his." And they create this strategy of a war of constant pressure. Both commanders found out that each other was vastly different than what they had been used to. And I think this is why the Overland campaign is one of the bloodiest that we have, is because this is two commanders that have never faced one another, and they're kind of feeling each other out. And both Grant and Lee are good at reading the other side. And when you have those two types of personalities on the battlefield, it's going to result in a lot of bloodshed. There is a standout that no one really realizes, and that's Jeb Stuart. He had performed extremely well against a much larger and better equipped force. By this time, the Union cavalry they've got more soldiers than the South does, and they've got better equipment. They've got better rifles, more improved rifles. And Jeb Stuart is able to hold them off. Granted, Meade pulls the cavalry back, but Jeb Stuart is able to hold them off where he can. This signaled to Grant, Meade, and more importantly Sheridan, that something needed to be done about Stuart. And so this would actually lead to Stuart's death just a few days later, because they need to get rid of Stuart. It was because of Stuart that that Robert E. Lee is able to find Grant and know where he is moving into the wilderness. And it's also because of Stuart that the cavalry is not as ineffective in many concerns, because the Southern cavalry is able to hold them off enough. And so just a few days later, Meade and Grant agree for Sheridan to move south and not to go towards Richmond. Stuart thinks that Sheridan is going towards Richmond, is going to capture Richmond, or at least attempt to. That's not the case. He is moving south to bring Stuart out into the open and to engage him and end his cavalry career, and he does. But that is one standout, is Jeb Stuart, that not many people realize out of this battle. We hear about Gordon and his brilliant flank attack, but Stuart needs to be recognized as one of those who stands out as one of the key players and MVPs of the Southern, of the Confederacy. On the northern side, you've got Hancock, who performs extremely well, but just is a victim of the wilderness.
Okay, so a couple quick questions for you. This is some of the commander. Okay, all right, first one. This, to me, was, when you look at it on paper and everything, the Army of the Potomac had never taken, even at Chancellorsville, had never taken this kind of pounding before like Lee gave him. Do you think that's a fair statement?
I don't think so. Well, it's all relative.
Right.
Trying to decide on what was the worst. Um, it was extremely brutal. You got over 17,000 Northern casualties, and 10,000 Confederate casualties. I can see where you're coming from. Possibly, that's an argument you can make, and I probably wouldn't disagree with it too much. One of the biggest fights that the Army of the Potomac was in with Robert E. Lee and get smashed so hard was Battle of Second Manassas.
Okay, sure.
That was an extremely brutal battle for both sides, but the Union kept throwing soldiers against Stonewall Jackson's lines, and he nearly broke, but Jackson was able to hold them off. And when Longstreet comes in and slams into John Pope's army, it's a very debilitating move for the against the North. And so, could this be seen as probably one of the biggest losses to the Union at the time? I can definitely see that, and I can support that argument. But don't count out Second Manassas, and don't count out too bad of Chancellorsville.
Okay. Any other commander, like you just said, would have went back above the river and licked their wounds, and they changed commanders again. You know, we've seen that time again. Does Lee? Does that give Lee one more chance to move north and roll the dice and maneuver, or does he stay and wait for the new commander to move?
Again, it's counterfactual history. When we look at all of his other achievements, whether it was Second Manassas or Chancellorsville, he moved right afterwards. With Grant, if Grant had moved back across the river, I don't know if Lee would have wagered another war in the North. He probably would have stayed back south of the river and waited it out again, just waiting for Grant to move. I can see that as being the only option because that's how he began this. He's trying to fill out Grant, and with such a devastating battle to both sides, even if Grant had moved away, Lee was still concerned because he does have the Army of the James coming down towards Richmond, and there's another army moving down the valley. And so he can't really afford to move north at that point.
Okay, and my final question, when I was young, I took war colleges, or war classes. There was no doubt about it how this battle was listed. You can even look at the papers from the time coming out and how the battle was. This was no doubt a tactical victory for Lee. Would you agree with that, or would you still go with this inconclusive as people are saying now?
That's a tough question because you got a couple factors to take in. One is, yes, it's a tactical victory in the sense that Lee is able to hold off Grant, but at the same, so he technically won the battle. But again, it's I guess it's a tactical victory and a strategic defeat because yes, because Lee holds off Grant. I guess that's the best way to explain it. Lee has held off Grant, but Grant doesn't move back. This doesn't stop Grant. He keeps moving south. And by him moving south, that forces Lee to move. And Grant knows that. And he's one reason Grant moved south is because he's afraid that Lee might move towards Richmond himself to guard against the Army of the James. And he might defeat the Army of the James before Grant can get down there because Grant is moving a much larger army. So that's one reason Grant's moving. But also Lee has set up a defensive line on the Orange Plank and Orange Turnpike. So he doesn't want to attack that. He's going to move further south, hopefully draw Lee back out into the open, at least with no fortifications. And that's, if anybody wants to read a couple of excellent books about fortifications in the Civil War, read Earl Hess's. He's got two works, one about Grant and Lee and how they set up fortifications, and then one general book about fortifications. But Earl Hess puts up a great book, and one of his main goal in that book is to show you that as the war progressed, soldiers began throwing up fortifications very quickly, and as soon as battles start to take place, if they can grab just a log and something else, they're putting it up in front of them, and that's considered a fortification in any respect. And so we see this happening, especially on the Overland campaign. I can't stress that enough. And that's another reason Grant moved south, is he doesn't want to attack fortifications yet. He wants to bring Lee back into the open where there's no more fortifications and then slug it out again.
Great, great synopsis of the battle, man. I enjoyed it. Is there anything else you wanted to add to it? That's all the questions I have for you.
No, I think that's it. I like dissecting battles. Of course, we've just covered a small portion of it, but I like dissecting the battles. And people may have found it strange. I actually wanted to describe what the wilderness is and what caused it, but that's my environmental history background. That's one of my nodes of excellence for my PhD is environmental history. And so not only do I like battles, I like knowing the terrain they're fought on and how that develops. That fascinates me nearly just as much as the battle movements do. And so as we talk more and do more interviews like this, I'm going to bring up more environmental history. Hopefully that'll catch somebody's eye and be like, I never thought of it that way. Because when you look at the environment, you look at the terrain, you look at the geography and geology of the area, it can actually tell you a whole lot about the battle and why soldiers moved the way they did.
Great, that would be something good for people to look at. I mean, I'll start paying attention to that. You well versed on the Western Front too? Then we'll have some Western Front people want some battles. So,
that's actually when I started doing Civil War history. I was complete Eastern theater. I loved the Army of Northern Virginia and the Army of the Potomac. That was the eternal struggle that those two armies had with one another. But when I was in undergrad at Lincoln Memorial University, I took actually Dr. Earl Hess in his Civil War class, which is an amazing thing to do, to take a man that's so well versed in the Civil War and is the man for a Civil War military history. There's no other historian out there better than him. And so to be one of his students was incredible. And when he did his Civil War class and he started talking about the Western theater, I solidly went to the Western theater, and that's been my focus of study ever since, is the Western theater. Although I do plenty of stuff on Gettysburg and the Eastern theater and the Battle of the Wilderness, but the Western theater has my heart. I absolutely love talking about the Western theater.
Great. Well, I'll pick out one of my favorite ones there next time, and we'll do a Western theater for the people.
That sounds wonderful.
Thanks for coming on, man, and I enjoyed it.
Thank you. I enjoyed it too.
All right, man.